This next lecture is called All and Everything About Gurdjieff Stapenders, and it begins with a picture of the 11th century monk Guido of Arezzo, who invented solfège using the first syllable and pitch of each line of the Latin hymn Ut quirent laxus, the hymn to St. John the Baptist, yielding Ut changed to Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, and then St. John, C, changed to T. And of course, from the sound of music, Do, a deer, a female deer, and then the name that Gurdjieff gave to Do, Re, Mi, Stapender. The mechanisms of how the law of 7 interacts with the law of 3 is of the utmost importance in the understanding of Gurdjieff's system, which is shown in his famous Enneagram. The only places this logic is touched upon is in Beelzebub's Tales to his Grandson, Chapter 17, Chapter 39, Chapter 40, where the 7 gravity centers, or notes, are called Stapenders by Gurdjieff, and in Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, Chapter 7, where Gurdjieff calls them note accelerations. This sparse information has created confusion of how to apply the Gurdjieff method, referred to as work. Some would say that work is following the circle from the beginning to the end, as in the Enneagram of personalities. Others will study the inscribed order of the unique pattern within the circle by dancing the Gurdjieff movement entitled Enneagram. Others will practice the work at Mi-Fa, Gurdjieff's external activation point, with breathing exercises. Others will practice work at Sol-La, Gurdjieff's Hanul Ud, observing themselves, and others will practice it at Ti-Do, Gurdjieff's intentional activation, storing bodily energies, and others will ignore the subject as too difficult and rely on the words taken from Chapter 39, such as being Padog duty, impartiality, conscious labors and intentional suffering, and intentional contemplativeness. In my essay, The Secret Enneagram of Gurdjieff and its relationship to universal vortex math, I describe the construction of the Enneagram, but here I will concentrate on the Stapenders of the law of Heptaparapashnak in relation to the law of Trier-Mazikamno, which are primarily described in Beelzebub's Tales to his Grandson, Chapter 39, Holy Planet Purgatory. It has always been the technique of Gurdjieff to make up a word in order to prevent the readers from associating their preconceived meaning, and this is true of Stapender. The two primary laws of Trier-Mazikamno and Heptaparapashnak can be easily substituted with the law of 3 from Chapter 17, page 138, arch absurd, as wholly affirming, wholly denying, and wholly reconciling, and the law of sevenfoldness, Chapter 30, page 493, the sacred law of Heptaparapashnak, or as they call it, the law of sevenfoldness. However, the problem arises in the inconsistency of Gurdjieff's definition, where he describes the Stapender, of which there are 7 in the law of Heptaparapashnak, as a gravity center. Chapter 17, page 139, arch absurd. And here I'm quoting. And so, my boy, the omnipresent Akidinuk obtains its prime rising in space outside of the most holy Sun Absolute itself, from the blending of these 3 independent forces into one, and during its further involutions, it is correspondingly changed in respect of what is called the vivifyingness of vibrations, according to its passage through what is called the Stapenders, or gravity centers, of the fundamental common cosmic sacred Heptaparapashnak. In chapter 40, page 848, the lore of Heptaparapashanak. I brought home from there also one sound-producing instrument, named their piano. I shall first of all elucidate to you with more accuracy about the same definite law of vibrations, which was first formulated by the great brothers as the 7 gravity center vibrations of sound. And then in chapter 40, page 841, the law of Heptaparapashanak, in the given place concerning the fundamental cosmic law of the sacred Heptaparapashanak, then called the law of ninefoldness, which would be do, re, mi, gap, fa, sol, la, ti, gap, according to that chapter. But the other definition is the distance between. You'll see in chapter 39, page 750, Holy Planet Purgatory. The first of these fundamental primordial cosmic sacred laws, namely the law of Heptaparapashanak, present-day objective cosmic science, by the way, formulates in the following words: the line of the flow of forces constantly deflecting according to law and uniting again at its ends. This sacred primordial cosmic law has 7 deflections, or, as it is still otherwise said, 7 centers of gravity, and the distance between each one of these deflections or centers of gravity is called a stoppender of the sacred Heptaparapashanak. And then chapter 39, page 753, Holy Planet Purgatory. In 3 of its stoppenders, he altered the what is called subjective actions, which had been until then in the stoppenders. In this respect, that he lengthened the law conformable successiveness, shortened it in another, and in a third disharmonized it. So you can see this is distance between, not gravity center. Now in chapter 7, page 125, in Search of the Miraculous by P. D. Uspensky, these notes are not lengthened, shortened, or disharmonized, but are analyzed according to acceleration of frequency, as shown. In the law of Heptaparapashanak, chapter 40, page 850, Gurdjieff set out to prove that the law of sevenfoldness exists in everything, such as opium, light, and sound, on page 827. After many digressions that intended to prove that ancient science was superior, Gurdjieff ends up concentrating on sound in the construction of the Lav Mers Nuk, page 851, which is at first just like a piano with white and black keys. I won't get into the description. These black strings, however, he named something or other, which according to the terminology of the beings of earth corresponded to what are called half-notes. And these half-note strings on the Lav Mers Nuk, which were not strung between whole notes, between which, according to the indications of these 2 Chinese saints, there is, according to the sacred Heptaparapashanak, no possibility of the independence of evolution and involution of the vibrations of sound. In these places, they were the first to call gaps. And in the given place of the octave where these gaps ought to be, this learned being, King Tu Tuts, strung special strings between the whole notes, made of the tail hairs of beings called their horse. These hair strings gave vibrations which were not always the same, and King Tu Tuts named these vibrations chaotic. This experiment did not end there, as this piano was improved by adding twice as many strings. The reason for adding ones between the chaotic horsehair strings seems to me to be absurd, and perhaps a mistake, as I believe only 12 more notes should have been added, not 14. On this Lav Mers Nuk, between these white, black, and hair strings, there were also strung on each octave 14 strings, also from twisted intestines, which were painted red. And if contemporary beings of the earth were to use these strings, they would call them quarter note. And here is what this piano would have looked like. The white note, the added red note, the black note, as it is on a piano, the horsehair strings. Contrary to the premise that the law of 7 was forgotten, here is a 24-note scale developed in the Middle East in the 18th century. Next, the world sound is mentioned, and I believe that this is contained in my paper, The Secret Enneagram of Gurdjieff and its Relationship to Universal Vortex Math, in which I derived all the notes in the circle of fifths using vortex math. And here are the results. And you'll note in these results that the C is the physics standard, and A is lower than the artificial orchestral standard of 440, which was chosen to make music brighter, but is really off-tone to nature. This chapter 40 ends with a discussion of the food octave, which will be discussed later when returning again to the subject of stoppenders. Rather than being told that some now unknown saints worked out the position of the gaps, I will now discuss how musical notes were derived by intervals and see if there is any scientific reason for the gaps. Although the frequency of the notes is important for relationship to our senses, it is not the frequency that creates the melody, but rather the interval between the frequencies. Although Gurdjieff made fun of the Greeks using only 5 notes, the pentatonic scale, they used 7 notes also. In fact, Pythagoras was the founder of musical theory by discovering a method to create all the notes in the circle of fifths. He did this by choosing the most pleasant tone, the fifth, which is 2 to 3, and added 6 perfect fifths successively in a positive outward direction in the spiral to create the intervals root do, P5 sol, M2 re, M6 la, M3 mi, M7 ti, and augmented fourth, and then added 6 perfect fifths in negative inner direction. Then the intervals P4 fa, M7 li, M3 re, M6 sil, M2 d, tritone, fi, diminished fifth were obtained. All these can be placed in one octave because of the similarity of all the octaves. Although this did have a problem with the augmented diminished fifth, the wolf tone, not completing a perfect circle. It set the foundation for the circle of fifths, which is the foundation of all modern music. Using Pythagoras' interval as a guide, we can access all those intervals by listening to them. So beginning with the root, a simple division of the octave is to multiply the frequency by 1.5, 3 to 2, which is the perfect fifth, being the fifth note, sol, that Pythagoras used. Its sound is as pure as the octave and can be confused by those who have little musical training. Another simple interval is obtained by multiplying the root by 1 1/3, 4 to 3, which is called the perfect fourth, being the fourth note, fa. In both of these, the frequency blends well and sounds aesthetically pleasing and consonant. Next in consonance is the major third, 5 to 4, and minor third, 6 to 5, third being the third note, mi, and the half tone down. Major sixth, which is 5 to 3, and minor sixth, 8 to 5. Sixth being the sixth note, la, and a half tone down. Actually, it is well known that when singing a note, the human voice contains overtones that fluctuate within the note. In fact, the study was done on human speech sounds, and it was in the Journal of Neuroscience. It was discovered that there are 8 peaks contained in these vocalizations that match those of the 6 we have assigned previously by consonants, including 2 others, the tritone, which is in the middle of the octave, and the minor 7th, being a half tone down from T, 9 to 5. Note that the lower the denominator, the greater its consonants. Also, the more overtones contained, the more its consonants. Looking at the gaps, 3 more tones can be added, although they are not as pleasing but dissonant. Yet often the short dissonance adds flavor. These are the major 7th, 15 to 8th, being T, the major 2nd, ratio of 9 to 8, the minor 2nd, ratio of 16 to 15, the 2nd being the first note Re and the half tone down. The tritone is also in the category of dissonant. So here are all 12 intervals as a piano keyboard octave, and the accelerations of the notes are calculated as was done in the previous Ouspensky diagram. In the key of C, it is true that the 2 places where the black notes are missing do show increase retarded for the white notes. But once the acceleration of both the white and black notes are calculated, this is no longer true. The reason for this is because the accelerations have been balanced out over the octave. Since the law of 7 is concerned with 7 notes, namely the white keys in the key of C, one might say that the places where the increase retarded missing black keys at Mi, Fa, and Ti, Do are still valid. Yet I would suggest that the premise of these being discontinuities is not true, and thus would be better called points of action. As to the subject of adding more notes, it is clear that the reason for the 2 missing black notes has to do with the shortened spacing. Certainly a black key can be placed in each of these places, but it would serve no purpose, as they would not sound perceptibly different. The use of horsehair would make these intervals worse. There is certainly significance to the fact that an octave contains 3 important numbers: 7 notes, 5 sharp notes, and thus 12 notes altogether. Given this, let us map the white and black notes on the enneagram to see how they match up with the inner triangle. After all, the closing statement from the Ouspensky diagram shown earlier seems to point to the inner triangle having more significance. And here is the mapping of the spacing as x's, and then saying that the distribution should be the x's forming the inner triangle is correct for those who are able to read the symbol and know what kind of shock is required for the passage of C to Do. Before doing this, it must be pointed out that pianos are the worst at reproducing the pure just intonation tones, because they have been tampered with by the process of equal temperament, and thus are barely able to reproduce the perfect 5th and 4th. This was done to allow the ability of playing in any key without having to retune, and thus we have had to accept music that has waves that are out of sync, beating against each other. If the objective is to have music that matches Pythagoras' imagined music of the spheres, then one needs to tune to just intonation, and avoid the keys that do not work or retune when desired. Today's technology can do this, but it brings up the question of whether music from nature is superior to mathematics. And here you can see the differences of how out of tune they are. And you can see that the 4th and the 5th are a good match, but others are quite out of tune. Now, measuring all the intervals precisely around the enneagram using a protractor, a surprising result is seen in this diagram, that all points of the triangle exactly match 3 of the most consonant intervals: the root note of the octave unison, the perfect 4th, Fa, and the major 6th, La. The sequence of Do unison, Fa perfect 4th, La major 6th clearly leads to the next octave Do, and this follows the inner triangle. The most consonant, perfect 5th, Sol, is at the bottom center, directly opposite the apex of the triangle, as if echoing the unison. The right-hand side is very crowded, from do to mi, as if it needs the uplift of fa, the perfect fourth. The note ti wants to resolve in do. More important is to observe and hear how these three sets of three within the octave demonstrate how the law of three acts within the 7 notes. Active side, mi to fa, sol, neutralizing side, sol to la, ti, and passive, ti to do, re. Now let us evaluate Gurdjieff's explanation of the Stoppenders in Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, Holy Planet Purgatory, Chapter 39. Our common Father, omni-being endlessness, having decided to change the principle of the maintenance of the existence of this then still unique cosmic concentration and sole place of His most glorious being, first of all altered the process itself of the functioning of these 2 primordial fundamental sacred laws, and He actualized the greatest change in the law of the sacred Heptaparapashanak. That's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. As to the law of 3, the alteration is never addressed. These changes in the functioning of the sacred Heptaparapashanak consisted in this, that in 3 of its Stoppenders He altered what is called the subjective actions, which had been until then in the Stoppenders. In this respect, that in 1, between the 3rd and 4th deflections, He lengthened the law-conformable successiveness, shortened it in another between the last deflection and the beginning of the new cycle, and in a 3rd disharmonized it. A Stoppender in the Arch Absurd chapter was clearly a note with a vibration, but now it is being referred to as a frequency change between notes, namely between mi, fa, and ti, do. As the Ouspensky diagram in Search of the Miraculous, Chapter 7, shown previously, both intervals are retarded, and I would expect that shortened means retarded, thus the first one cannot be lengthened. Both have an acceleration of 16/15. Perhaps the meaning of subjective action needs to be analyzed, thus lengthening might refer to the crowded right side of the triangle containing do, ti, re, mi, and shortening to the sparse left-hand side of the triangle containing li and ti. Comparing the lengthening of mi, fa and the shortening of ti, do to Ouspensky Chapter 7, it appears to be the exact opposite, where lesser energy is needed at mi, fa and more at ti, do. The reasoning given is that the vibration ti, do is a considerably higher pitch, and this might seem more plausible. It does leave one bewildered as to the scientific explanations given, and this essay has already shown that these discontinuities do not exist, but rather are musically created points of action. What Gurdjieff says to Ouspensky is this. In an ascending octave, the first interval comes between mi and fa. If corresponding additional energy enters at this point, the octave will develop without hindrance to si. But between si and do, it needs a much stronger additional shock for its right development than between mi and fa, because the vibrations of the octave at this point are at a considerably higher pitch, and to overcome a check in the development of this octave, a greater intensity is needed. In the descending octave, on the other hand, the greatest interval occurs at the very beginning of the octave, immediately after the first do, and the material fulfilling it is often found either in the do itself or in the lateral vibrations evoked by do. For this reason, a descending octave develops much more easily than an ascending octave, and in passing beyond si, it reaches fa without hindrance. Here an additional shock is necessary, though considerably less strong than the first shock between do and si. So the statement above that the material fulfilling it Do to T is very often found either in Do itself or in the lateral vibrations evoked by Do, supports my creation of T-Do as the AO Alpha Omega. Here Gurdjieff defines the discontinuities in Beelzebub's Tales. Gurdjieff's first stoppender is lengthened. It is called the mechano-coinciding midland, mi to fa. Its location name is unchanged by me, and namely with the purpose of providing the requisite inherency receiving for its functioning the automatic affluence of all forces which were near, he lengthened the stoppender between the third and fourth deflections. This same stoppender of the sacred Harapachnak is just the one which is still called the mechano-coinciding midland. Gurdjieff's second stoppender shortened T-Do, which I have suggested should be called AO Alpha Omega. And the stoppender which he shortened is between the last deflection and the beginning of a new cycle of its completing process. By the same shortening, for the purpose of facilitating the commencement of a new cycle of its completing process, he predetermined the functioning of the given stoppender to be dependent only upon the affluence of forces obtained from, and there he says outside, but I think inside is better, through that stoppender, from the results of the action of that cosmic concentration itself, which the completed process of the primordial fundamental sacred law flows, and the stoppender of the sacred Heptaparapashnak is just that one which is called the intentionally actualized midland. And note, I changed outside to inside because it seems to violate the whole point of results within the octave being manifested in the completed Do. It may have been confused in the sense that in the creation of the universe, the shortening allowed our endlessness to project his Theomurk Magalos, or Word God, down through the octaves of creation, thus from the outside. Gurdjieff's third stoppender, disharmonized soul law, Hanal Ut, which I have suggested would be better called the intentionally actualized midland, using the label from his second stoppender above. As regards the third stoppender, then changed in its subjective action, and which is fifth in general successiveness, and is called Hanal Ut. Its disharmony flowed by itself from the change of the two aforementioned stoppenders. This disharmony in its subjective functioning flowing from its asymmetry, so to say, in relation to the whole sacred Heptaparapashnak, consists in this. Number one, which I call chaos. If the completing process of this sacred law flows in conditions where during its process there are many extraneously caused vibrations, then all of its functioning gives only external results. And number two, I am calling quiet. But if the same process proceeds in absolute quiet, without any external extraneously caused vibrations whatsoever, then all the results of the action of its functioning remain within that concentration in which it completes its process. And for the outside, these results only become evident on direct and immediate contact with it. And number three, which I call chaos and quiet. And if, however, during the functioning there are neither of these two sharply opposite conditions, then the results of the action of its process usually divide themselves into the external and the internal. Now, I assume that soul law, number three, is being Padog Judy, since it is a middle path, and since further down, after the need to understand the fundamental cosmic laws, he mentions impartiality. And here is what he says. Try very hard to understand everything that will relate to these fundamental cosmic sacred laws. And I won't continue what he says, but only you'll see that understanding the laws crystallizes data for engendering that divine property which is indispensable for every normal, free-brained being to have, and they call it impartiality. So now at the end of the chapter of Holy Planet Purgatory in 806 to 810, which seems to be posed as a joke about monks, I believe Gurdjieff reveals the need to follow soul law number 3, which I believe is being Padok Judy. The knowledge about this will give you additional data for elucidating by concrete examples certain particularities which I have already explained to you of the fundamental cosmic sacred law, Heptaparapashnak. After the loss of the continent Atlantis, certain knowledge concerning the origin and significance of this same being Exiohari, Gurdjieff's second stopender, T to Do, also survived, and this knowledge also began to pass from generation to generation. In these, though fragmentary, yet nevertheless authentic informations, it was very convincingly indicated that by means of the substances Exiohari, or sperm, formed in them, it was possible to perfect oneself, but unfortunately for them, there were no indications in this information which had survived and reached them what and how precisely this had to be done. Ultimately, after long conscious observations and intensive active meditations, categorically understood that this was indeed possible, exclusively only on condition of a ceaseless fulfillment of being Padok Judy. This is Gurdjieff's third stopender, Soul La, item 3 above, the combination of chaos and quiet. And those of them, beings of the said generation as well as certain subsequent 2 generations, who began seriously to actualize this, did indeed attain the expected results. But already the 4th generation of these beings who were first interested in this question and were followers not from essence conviction but from a property called to imitate, which had by that time also become inherent in these terrestrial 3-brained beings, also began to exist together for segregated common existence are called their monasteries, and the separate beings belonging to these sects, monks. At the present time, many of these monasteries exist there, and these innumerable monks who enter them do indeed strictly abstain from the ejection from themselves in the customary way of being Exiohari, or sperm formed in them. But of course no sensible result at all is ever obtained from this abstinence of theirs. It is, however, unjust to say that no sensible result at all is obtained among these monks there. There are even obtained among them sensible results of 2 independent kinds. Here I'm calling these the monks. The first kind of action of this definite substance consists in this, that it promotes the depositing of superfluous, what is called something or other, or as they call it there, fat. And this is related to Gurdjieff's third stopender, Soul La, chaos item number 1. And the second group I'm calling Jesuits. Sorry, I went to high school and college under them. And this second kind of action promotes the arising and the dispensing over the whole planetary body of what is called poisonous vibrations. And in the second case, on the contrary, these abstaining monks become, as is also usually there, meager thin, and the action of the poisonous vibrations which penetrate through them is chiefly evident in their general psyche, which becomes sharply dual, and the manifestations of which are divided into 2 diametrically opposite kinds: the outer visible, for show, sensed by everyone around them, and the inner and hidden, which the ordinary beings there, especially the contemporary, are entirely incapable of ascertaining or perceiving. Namely, in their outer visible manifestations, these poisonous monks appear to be what your favorites would express as bigots of a high degree, and in their hidden inner manifestations, not shown to others, what your favorites would call expert cynics, also of a high degree. So here's a summary in a chart about the monks. We have the monks at the 5th stopender, Hanal Ut. Number 1, chaos, 100% external. Then we have the Jesuits at the 5th stopender, Hanal Ut. Number 2, quiet, 100% internal. Then for the fifth stop into Honol Ut, number 3, chaos and quiet, I'm using the picture of Gurdjieff because I'm associating it with being Padog Judy. So here we go. We have protocosmos. Gurdjieff's third stop into, now referred to as the fifth stop into Honol Ut, Sol La, is now the engine of world creation, starting with the creation of stars, whereas in Ouspensky, it appears to be Mi Fa, the automatic activator that creates. Still, it is not clear which of the three factors of Honol Ut were involved in the first step of world creation. Chaos 1, quiet 2, or a combination of chaos and quiet number 3. Since our endlessness is shown to have a previous kingdom, although slowly diminishing from time itself, one might have expected that Honol Ut number 2, quiet, would be the initial action. But then the results would be all internal. No Big Bang here. But considering that our endlessness was very vexed at losing his kingdom, it must be Honol Ut number 1, chaos, that acts to create 100% external results. And note, in this case, the creation energy of our endlessness would be through Gurdjieff's intentional activator. Intentional for God, but not humans. This is the reason I want to move the internal activator to Gurdjieff's Honol Ut position. So now we have Deferto-Cosmos, and we have it created by the monks, because it's the fifth stop in their Honol Ut number 1, chaos, 100% external. It creates Deferto-Cosmos, the second order sun, and Macrocosmos, which is left out, which would be all the sun's galaxies. So here I'm quoting from Beelzebub's Tales, the creation of stars. Thanks to this new particularity of the fifth stop under the sacred Heptaparaparshanah, emanations issuing from the Holy Sun Absolute began to act on certain definite points of the space of the universe upon the prime source cosmic substance, Etherokrilno, which, owing to the totality of the former and new particularities of the sacred primordial laws, certain definite concentrations began to be concentrated. Further, thanks to these factors and also to their own laws of Heptaparaparshanah and Triamazikamno, which had already begun to arise in these definite concentrations with their action upon each other, everything which had to be gradually begun to be crystallized in these concentrations, and as a result of this, these large concentrations were obtained which exist also until now, which are called second-order suns, stars, the sun. The law of three takes over. The holy Thermurtamagalogos began to manifest itself in the quality of the third holy force of the sacred Triamazikamno, with the stars as active force and the galaxies as passive force, creating third-order suns, planets. So here's a picture of Tritocosmos. In this case, it's created by Triamazikamno. You have one sun as active, all suns as passive, and Theomurtamagalogus is the neutral force. And first of all, it creates Tritocosmos, third-order sun, planet, and Mesocosmos, which is unnamed, all planets. So here is the quote from Beelzebub's Tales about the creation of planets. When these newly arised suns had been completely actualized, and their own functionings of both the fundamental laws had been finally established in them, then in them also, similarly to the most holy Sun Absolute, their own results began to be transformed and to be radiated, which together with the emanations issuing from the most holy Sun Absolute into the space of the universe, became the factors for the actualization of the common cosmic fundamental process of the sacred law of Triamazikamno, and that is to say, the most holy Theomertamagalos began to manifest itself in the quality of the third holy force of the sacred Triamazikamno. The results of any of the newly arisen second-order suns began to serve as the first holy force, and the results of all the other newly arisen second-order suns in relation to this mentioned one newly arisen sun as the second holy force of this sacred law. Thanks to the process of the common cosmic sacred Triamazikamno, thus established in the space of the universe, crystallizations of different what is called density gradually began to be formed around each of the second-order suns out of that same prime source, ether or Krilno, and grouping themselves around these newly arisen suns, new concentrations began to take form, as a result of which more new suns were obtained, but this time third-order suns. These third-order concentrations are just those cosmic concentrations which at the present time are called planets. Then there's microcosmos. In this case, I have a picture of Gajev because it's the fifth stop in their Honol number 3, chaos and quiet, 50% external and 50% internal. That creates microcosmos, similarities of the already arisen atoms, cells. So here's a quote from Beelzebub's Tales on the creation of microcosmos. After the formation of the third-order suns or planets, just here, owing to the changed fifth deflection of the sacred Heptaparapashanok, which I have already said is now called Honol Ut, the initially given momentum for the fundamental completing process, having lost half the force of its vivifyingness, began in its further functioning to have only half of its action outside itself, and the other half for itself, i.e., for its very own functioning, the consequences of which were that on these last big results, i.e., on these said third-order suns or planets, there began to arise what are called similarities to the already risen. Microcosmoses. Having stated that this action had lost half the force of its vivifyingness, suggests that Honol Ut number 3, chaos and quiet, 50% chaos, 50% quiet, is now responsible for the creation of the similarities to the already risen microcosmos, atoms, organic cells on the planets. And here I am quoting from Beelzebub's Tales. And as after this, surrounding conditions of actualizations were everywhere established corresponding to the manifestation of the second particularity, the fifth stopender of the fundamental sacred Heptaparapashanok. Therefore, from then on, the actualization of the fundamental outer cycle of the sacred Heptaparapashanok ceased, and all the action of the functioning entered forever into the results already manifested by it, and in them there began to proceed its inherent permanent processes of transformation called evolution and involution. Now, evolution and involution refers to the Holy Planet Purgatory, page 760, the common cosmic Anazabulazar. Everything issuing from everything, and again entering into everything. Clearly, this energy passes through Do in both directions. This is what I signify in my term for T-Do as Ao, the Alpha Omega. Now we have the creation of Tatarocosmos, humans, and it's represented by the Jesuit because it's the fifth stop into Honol Ut number 2, quiet, 100% internal, together with the mutual attraction of the similar, creating Tatarocosmos, humans. So here's a quote from Beelzebub's Tales, the creation of humans. And namely, they named the most Holy Prime Source, Holy Sun Absolute, Protocosmos. Each newly arised second-order sun with its consequent definite results they call Deuterocosmos, third-order suns. And those we call planets they call Tritocosmos. Smallest relatively independent formation on the planets which arose to the new inherency of the fifth stopender of the sacred Heptaparapashnak, which is the very simplest similarity to the whole, is called microcosmos. And finally, these formations of microcosmos, which also became concentrated on the planets, this time thanks to the second order cosmic law called mutual attraction of the similar, were named Tetatocosmos, humans. After the creation of microcosmos, similarities to the already risen atoms, organic cells, it specifically states that the second particularity of the fifth stopender is being used here, and that is Hanal-ut number 2, quiet, 100% internal. Having occurred after the creation of microcosmos and before Tetatocosmos, it must be responsible for the creation of the next cosmos, Tetatocosmos, even though it seems to attribute it to the second order cosmic law, mutual attraction of the similar. Thus I will add Hanal-ut number 2 to the creation of Tetatocosmos, and this implies the building of a spirit and soul within. So now, as you see, we've used all three types of the fifth stopender, Hanal-ut. Then, in a strange aside, the last stopender for us is defined as the moon and Anulius instead of within the earth, and this is the reason why we have male and female sexes. And I won't read that. Then in the next section, Hanal-ut appears again as creating the subjective properties of all the active elements, and likewise they're what is called proportions of vivifyingness. At first I imagined the insane scientist Raven Gornahor Harhawk or his son Rakorik being the independent individual manipulating the active elements, but then I realized that it is most applicable to the food octave. In the food octave, the fifth stopender, Sol La, and the attraction and fusion of similarities are important engines, but most important is you as an independent individual with conscious intention. This supports my labeling of Sol La as the intentional activator. So here is the quote from Beelzebub's Tales. It is necessary for you to bear in mind for a clear representation of these processes, then in our megalocosmos, from results which have already flowed from every kind of trago-order egocratic process. There are many hundreds of independent active elements with various specific subjective properties which take part in new formations. These many hundreds of active elements with active properties, wherever they might be, proceeding from the 7 stopenders of the fundamental cosmic sacred Heptaparapashnak, are depending upon the stopender from which they received their primordial arising, divided and localized according to what are called the affinity of vibrations into 7 what is called classes, and all without exception of these large and small already definite concentrations in our megalocosmos are formed from these active elements belonging to 7 independent classes, and as I have already told you, they have their own subjective property. And these subjective properties of theirs, and likewise their what are called proportions of vivifyingness, are actualized. Firstly, according to what form of functioning of the fifth stopender of the sacred Heptaparapashnak was flowing during their arising, and secondly, whether the given active elements arise owing to the conscious intention of some independent individual, or whether they arose automatically merely owing to the second grade law called attraction and fusion of similarities. And here is the enhanced food octave, which is obtained by adding the stopinders described in the food octave section of Holy Planet Purgatory, with corrections from my essays. Key to the Soul is within the missing stopinder of the food octave, and my essay, Photonic Soul, and incorporating the information gained in mapping musical intervals. Thus ends references to stopinder in Holy Planet Purgatory. I'm returning again to that last part of Chapter 40 in Beelzebub's Tales. The fundamental cosmic law of Heptaparapashna, page 869, gives an example from the piano of passing through Hanal-Ut, soul to law. Unfortunately, being Pangyohari is misplaced, as this corresponds to soul, whereas the meaning intended is the missing stopinder, which I have named harmoniary. You can see key to the soul is within the missing stopinder of the food octave. Therefore, soul needs to transform into harmoniary. As to me or CT, this relates to the gaps, which is impossible to prove in a vacuum, because in a vacuum there is no sound. So there he goes on to describe what I just said with its mistakes. Now, having seen how the musical instruments map exactly to the points of the triangle, we must no longer think of these as discontinuities, but rather as points of action. These are the places where the octaves of body, spirit, and soul interact with each other. And you could see my essay called Three-Body Enneagram. I will now present a more precise and less confusing presentation of the 3 points of action. First point of action is Mi-Fa. It's the automatic activator, AA. The second point of action, Sol-La, is the intentional activator, IA. And the third point of action, T-Do, is the Alpha Omega, AO. Each point of action is governed by the inner triangle, which is the law of 3 acting in the law of 7. And each point of action has an inner law of 3. The active side is Mi-Fa Soul, and its point of action, the automatic activator, AA, is between Mi and Fa. This is automatic because the energies pass through it by some automatic means. For example, Mi-Fa Soul passes from Mi to Fa by means of air from the outside taken in by the lungs. The neutralizing side is Sol-La-Ti, and the point of action, the intentional activator IA, is between Sol and La. It is intentional because it only passes through Sol to La with intention. For example, Sol to La-Ti passes from Sol to La by means of conscious sensing of photons. Then the passive side is T-Do-Re, and its point of action is Alpha Omega, AO. It is the starting Do, the completed Do, an octave higher. The interval T-Do being the completion of the octave Do-Re-Mi-Fa-Sol-La-Ti-Do, has a greater function than mere completion. T-Do is like a converging point, as in mathematics, and thus should be considered as part of the higher Do. Its action is best described by the Christian symbol from the Book of Revelation, AO, Alpha Omega, with its connotation of the first shall be last and the last shall be first. This is also similar to Ouroboros, the snake that bites its tail. So here is my diagram showing the engine that governs these 7 notes by a central triangle, and it is the Enneagram. Let's discuss again the reason for retiring Hanal-Ut and the moving of the intentional activator to the position Sol-La. So again, the definition of Hanal-Ut, mostly extraneous vibrations give only external results, absolute quiet gives only internal results, and both together give both results. Other than the joke about fat monks and Jesuits, there does not seem to be anything of value other than number 3, the creation of fat Jesuit monks. This is similar to what Gurdjieff told Uspensky about 3 methods of self-development: Fakirs, body work; monks, emotional work; yogis, mental work, and then saying that the way of the sly man, body, emotion, and mind, is better because it allows one to apply the work in ordinary life. Assuming that Honel Ut 3 is being Padag Judy, then its description of inner and outer results still does not define the work. Would not the way of the meager thin Jesuits be better because 100% towards the soul is better than 50%? Logic says that position soul law must be the whole engine for self-development. It is the point where conscious action can create the energy that can bridge T-Do into the higher Do. It is, after all, the mechanism that created the whole universe. But do you really want to go around saying, I practice Honel Ut, as the poor follower of Beelzebub Ahu would no doubt say? This is a good reason, but the primary one is because this is a place where intentional action is needed. Besides, T-Do is better to be called Alpha Omega, AO, because once T is incorporated into Do, it is the place where, in Revelations, first shall be last, and the last shall be first, as the beginning and the end inside itself. The Do is paramount to the creation of the higher bodies of spirit and soul, because the completed body is their springboard. At T, intentional activation is already too late. As to the intervals T-Do and Mi-Fa, this essay showed that the missing black notes are just there because of just intonation, musical choices. Thus one needs to look for musical reasons rather than seeing missing black notes on a piano. For instance, when you play T on a piano, you can hear it wanting to resolve into the higher Do, and in the same way you can hear the Do, Re, Mi wanting to resolve into Fa. The 3 important intervals in the Enneagram, which are due to the symmetry of the law of 3 within the octave, are active, Mi, Fa, Sol, the automatic activator AA, neutralizing Sol, La, T, the intentional activator IA, and passive T-Do, Re, the Alpha Omega, AO. These are the 3 points of action that are needed to connect body, spirit, and soul in a 3-body Enneagram. See my essay, 3-Body Enneagram. Now, here are thoughts on how our endlessness in Holy Planet Purgatory, chapter 39, page 749 to 755, solved the gradual diminishing of volume of his dwelling place on the Holy Son Absolute. From the 3rd most sacred canticle of our cherubim and seraphim, we are worthy of learning that our Creator Omnipotent once ascertained that the same Holy Son Absolute on which he dwelt with his cherubim and seraphim was already almost imperceptibly, yet nevertheless gradually, diminishing in volume. You must first of all know that this most Holy Son Absolute was maintained and existed on the basis of the system called auto-egocrat, and on that principle according to which the inner forces which maintain the existence of this cosmic concentration had an independent functioning, not depending on any forces proceeding from outside, and which are based also on those 2 fundamental sacred laws, by which at the present time also the whole present megalocosmos is maintained, and on the basis of which it exists, and namely on the basis of those 2 fundamental primordial sacred laws called the sacred Heptaparapashanok and the sacred Triamazakosmo. This wonderful story is a metaphor for ourselves growing old. Having shown in this essay that the 3 changes that our endlessness made to the law of Heptaparapashanok never happened, it does not mean that we cannot use our knowledge of the law of 3 and the law of 7 to find a way to defeat time. We need only look at the theme of the law of Heptaparapashnak, chapter 40, about how people learned and again forgot about the fundamental cosmic law of Heptaparapashnak. This is what we do every day. We forget. We tend to want to exist within our minds, egos. The outside world affects us, but we insulate ourselves from it and ignore the times that it threatened us. Thus the law of 7 and the law of 3 just spin around like the hands of a clock, and time eventually takes its toll with death. With the knowledge of where to intervene in the law of 7, as shown in the Enneagram, we can defeat death. In that all-important place of soul law, we must apply the necessary actions every minute of every day, which I have described in detail in Photonic Soul. Ironically, it is the Harapas, the flow of time, which supplies the challenges that give each one of us the chance to build an eternal soul. Without the flow of time, we would not exist. Death is the absence of time. In those states of deep meditation, love, or thought, when time stands still, it is then that we can sense that place where time no longer exists, but is not death. It is time eternal. It is your soul. So now, considering that the stoppender is also related to other processes, I have now included the Enneagram of color. Certainly the spectrum of light is said to have 7 notes like sound has 7 notes. It would be appropriate to map, thus placing the RGB and the CMY color triangles into the Enneagram using Newton's color wheel. The concept of the octaves in the Enneagram relates to audible sound, and everyone knows that the notes in a piano do not sound in a vacuum. This is because sound requires displacement of air into waves of certain frequencies that carry the sound out from the source. I wondered, therefore, whether sound octaves would exist in places outside of the Earth's atmosphere. Although we can ascribe sounds to all sorts of mediums in the cosmos, these sounds can only exist to the edge of the medium. I remember asking myself this question, and it started me thinking about color, because it is based on photons of light from different stars that can travel through the empty vacuum of space. Their color is dependent upon their spin that produces a measurable vibration. Given that there are 7 colors in the solar spectrum, it makes sense to try to place them in the Enneagram, as we do for the musical octave. But it's not entirely obvious how to map them into a circle, as the solar spectrum is a straight line. In 1671, Isaac Newton described the colors using a prism as the famous Roy G. Biv mnemonic for red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, and violet. He pushed the color indigo because he was anxious to use the magic 7 number, but indigo has now fallen into disuse as no one has been able to see it as distinct. It is also not clear what is meant by the colors blue, indigo, and violet. In 1810, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe published The Theory of Colors, which explored the idea that colors were related to perception and that darkness is not merely the absence of light, but its polar opposite, capable of interacting with light. So he showed how different colors were visible based on the position of the prism and the size of the slits, thus showing that Newton's experiment was a special case. He recognized only 6 primary colors in his color wheel, but it does appear that he recognized magenta, which he called purple. This is one of the 3 primary pigments used in printers, which was officially patented as a color in 1859 and renamed after the Italian town where a battle was won by Napoleon III in that year. In this concept of perception, Goethe foreshadowed the scientific experiments which showed that the retinas of the human eye have 3 color receptors. Despite these receptors not being equally spread over the spectrum, the brain is capable of seeing all the colors, including magenta, which is not in the solar spectrum. Interestingly, when staring at green and turning off the lights, magenta appears, because its vibration is halfway between violet and red of the spectrum, with the same vibration as green. Thus it is the polar opposite of green, like an antiphoton. After placing the colors in the first obvious correspondence to dou T, with their average vibration within their ranges, their vibration ratios were compared to see if it was similar to the notes with their vibration retardation at Mi, Fa, and Ti, Do. But they were all uniform, with only large changes at each end of the spectrum, which are attributable to the large ranges of red and violet. It is possible that the short range of yellow might be the clue to the position near Mi, Fa, and the interesting observation that yellow and cyan look like bookends to the green. But other than that, there appears to be no correspondence to the anagram positioning of the notes. And here is a diagram of the notes as Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti. Then looking at the color wheel, which is the standard color wheel, I was amazed by the symmetry, as it shows the primary additive colors of light, red, green, and blue, used in TV screens as a triangle, and the secondary subtracted pigment colors cyan, magenta, and yellow, used for printing as an upside-down triangle. The tertiary colors are between them on two other triangles, turned 30 degrees and 60 degrees. There are 6 colors which come from the primary triangle and the inverted secondary triangle, and when added to the important tertiary colors of orange and violet, they add up to 8 colors. Note that the hexagram in the center, with its sides black and white to indicate the RGB, together make white, and CMY make black. At first it appeared to me that it was impossible to relate this to the enneagram until I looked at Newton's color circle. Here Newton placed violet at C at Do, which is strange, but this was a perfect clue to rotating the color wheel above so that magenta is at the top, thus removing the tertiary colors with the exception of orange and violet, with orange needed to make Mi, and violet being the perfect candidate for the higher Do. And the result is here. Now look at how beautifully this compares with the enneagram of sound and to the cosmos. Thus ends my talk. Thank you for following along. I know this is a very complex subject. I've revised and revised over and over again, but I still think it's worth it to go through, as it goes to the very heart of the law of 7 and the law of 3.